when I see this huge creature, immediately I think about a huge alpinia, a little bit same as Alpinia boya, for instance, in Fiji Island. But here, I see the inflorescence hanging, and what is for me incredible is that I see bright dark red bracts on the hanging inflorescence, and these are really like Heliconia bracts, especially the American Heliconias, and we know that in Pacific Island there are very few species of Heliconia which usually are not at all like this, because Heliconia in Pacific Island have erect inflorescence with erect bracts. So very difficult to understand, because in Alpinia usually we never see big bracts like this, usually quite small and not very colorful bracts, and moreover the very thin axis of the inflorescence is quite surprising. So I try to solve this enigma, because for me it's really a huge enigma. So we see this hanging inflorescence of this Alpinia. So we see the incredibly beautiful helmet-shaped bract totally protecting the flowers. And we see here the flower at anthesis, which is a so strange dark purple, almost blackish. So there is a contrast between the orange bract, especially in transparency, very orange, with a surface which is totally crinkled, and we see the flowers emerging. So we see that after all the fruits are maturing, protected by the helmet bract just above, and we can clearly see that many flowers are appearing under each bract. So it's a congested small inflorescence protected by the helmet bract just above. Our flowers are opening one after the other. We see here the perfect design of the flower. We see the hanging infructescence with quite a big bright orange fruits. It's really cylindrical shaped a little bit, with the remaining part of the calyx at the top, the brown calyx, tubular at the top of the fruit, which is the ovary which did increase, and we see also some traces of the bract. So really the structure is very Alpinia structure. Here we see the so long infructescence. We see the bract, which were dark purple and mix of orange and purple, and we see the fruits which are totally ripe, all are falling. We see. I want to see how is the structure inside. Seeds are embedded in a yellow pulp and quite big. They are about 5-7 millimeters. I try to remove them. Seeds are about 4-5 millimeters. We are now in the Manusela National Park in the center of Seram. We are at about 1,000 something meters above sea level. It's raining a little bit, of course. It's a rainforest and even here a cloud forest. And I was very surprised because I did see liana climbing on a tree. And when I did look at the leaves, at the stem, I had some hesitation between piper or an aracee. We see it here, but actually when I approach, we see that the leaf shape is perfectly heart-shaped. We see the base with the two lobes, and in detail here we clearly see the venation pattern characteristic of ficus species with all the small square structures which are delimitation of the last type of venation, probably the tertiary or quaternary vines, very narrow vines. And also when we see the apex, which is pointed and covered by a stipule, and I did think maybe it could be a ficus, and I remove one old, oh yes, when I remove one leaf, no doubt at all, we see the white latex. So I'm very surprised because I did never see a climbing ficus with leaves like this, like a piper, and we see the stem hanging freely, and it's very different from most climbing ficus, which have very specialized lateral branches bearing the figs. Actually, it's also climbing a little bit in spiral because we see clearly the quite big stem here. Okay, so many short lateral stem, one of the many stranchings of the Maluku Islands. So we see again this shrubby tree-like Musanda, and it's interesting, we see here the inflorescence, and we see this stem which is totally covered with leaves, but just above we see hanging brown fruits, and what's interesting is that actually a branch is globally flowering, and after flowering it produces the fruits and it dies and it falls a little bit down. So it means actually that these branches are in some way monocarpic. I did try to approach, but we see actually, though, while the fruits are maturing and hanging, so hanging like this, maybe they are taken by bats, by frugivorous bats, because same like ficus, so it seems it's bat fruits. Here we see a very tall climbing lycopodium. It's emerging from the soil, and the main stem is climbing on all the lateral stem. Of course, it's a dichotomous branching, but it's totally unequal dichotomous branching, and the main stem has quite recurved scales, which allows the stem globally to climb on the small shrubs and trees just around. So we see the main climbing stem, and we see actually the scales which are a little bit spiny and totally downward recurved, and this allows the stem to climb among other shrubs. And we see the small leaves which are really only 2 or 3 millimeters long and very, very narrow. Upper surface of the stem, and we clearly see the assimilatory part with the crowded small leaves with short internodes, which are the assimilatory part of the plant, and we see the main stems which have long, narrow scale leaves and longer internodes, so it's perfect to have the distribution of the leaves in all directions horizontally. And here we see the lower surface of the stem. We clearly see the long scales on the main stem. And I see also here the strobili, hanging strobili at the end of the stems. A casuarina or gymnostoma. I don't know, but what is interesting is that it's growing in altitude, more than 1,000 meters above sea level, and it is really a forest species and not a pioneer species, contrary to many other casuarina. In this very deeply shaded place in the forest understory, in the gully, I see suddenly a very strange plant which has ensiform leaves like iris, totally disticus leaves, and a white inflorescence emerging from the middle with small flowers. And for me, in some way, it recalls me member of Hemodoraceae, for instance, as the genus Schickia or Xiphidium in South America, but there are also this group of family, especially in Australia, but so eastern part of the Wallacea line. So here we clearly see the small white flowers, not really open, but really a little bit like a Schickia orinocensis leaves, flowers, but Schickia orinocensis, as the name suggests, is from South America. We see also one bract enclosing the base of the inflorescence, prominent vine in the middle of this ensiform leaf. Ici, on dirait qu'il est presque 6 heures du soir. So this is obviously the stems of a climbing bamboo, climbing in a direction. Oh yes, we see it climbing here on the trees. We see the lateral branches, and actually we see that all are emerging from a huge clump which is here, and we can see the foliage just above me, very narrow leaves. I've seen quite many species of climbing bamboos, but never like this, with so narrow stems and mostly so long internodes. Internodes are about 1 meter long, very, very narrow, and it's a strange, how can it climb vertically with nothing to support? But anyway, it is able to climb. Sometimes it's a branching, but very elegant curves and very strange growth habit to climb like this. So I see the clump here with all the narrow stems moving inside the trees, tree branches just above. We see that all these stems are emerging from a base, so it is a clump, and we see clearly the stems climbing in the trees, but again, difficult to understand how it can climb because not at all spines, no hairs, nothing. So probably when it's very young, it's very rigid, and only after it can move, but it's efficient. It's able to go in all directions in all the trees around, and we see the narrow foliage just above. I love this so small nephrolepis with perfectly hanging fronds. It is quite common here in this forest, but when the fronds are long enough, we see they are totally bending downward. Here on this slope in the Manusela National Park, I see we are at about 1,100 meters above sea level. I see a medinilla with big leaves, where there is a perfect venation we know in the medinilla. The young leaves are red, accumulation of humus, so classical way to have some humus in the center between the leaves, but what is incredibly beautiful is this inflorescence. I've not at all seen before such bright red. It's coral, more than coral, it's totally bright red axis of the inflorescence and also of the small lateral parts of the inflorescence. So it's a branch inflorescence, which is usual in medinilla, and here in this case all the axes are bright red, and at the top is one little bowl-shaped thing, and this thing actually, when I look, it's not flower bud, it is young developing fruits. So probably now there are the beautiful yellow, green-yellow color, but probably they will become, when we see this red color, we can guess that maybe they will become black to have the perfect contrast between red and black. But at this stage, it's already incredibly beautiful. And here we see the very bright, dark red color of the young leaves. We see purple. So green, purple, red, yellow, and actually here I see another inflorescence which is much more compact. I try to move a little bit. Oh yes, so here between the two last leaves in the terminal part of the stem we see this hanging structure which is a young inflorescence, and it's interesting because at this stage the peduncle of the inflorescence is not bright red, it is more dark pink, and the flowers, so here is a flower bud. We see the flowers will be white because we see all these crowded flower buds which are white. So at this stage, not yet elongation between each flower. Elongation is appearing when the fruits are maturing. So we see really two different ways. Probably for pollinators, it will be the best way to have crowded flowers like this and not expanded and distant from each other. So strategy, of course, is not the same for the flowering and pollination and for the dispersal of the fruits. Anyway, it's a very beautiful population. Oh yes, and here I see a very young inflorescence, which is totally ball-shaped like this. All the flowers are already developed but totally congested, and only the base of the inflorescence peduncle is beginning to develop. So we see really the successive stages in the development of this inflorescence of this incredibly beautiful Medinilla. This begonia with huge orbicular leaves, very shiny because the rain is falling on it, and it is an erect species. It's not at all a creeping species like many other we have seen before of the Petermania subgenus. It is so another group of begonia, and here we see developing fruits, and we see at the top the male flowers and the fruit, so it is obviously another subgenus. On this vertical bank, mix of stone and earth, just above a small forest stream, we see another species of Medinilla which has much smaller leaves actually than the previous one, and a big difference is that this one is cauliflorous. We see that all along the defoliate stem, we see the emerging infructescence. So we see the pedunculate infructescence, everything is red. The peduncles and the berries are red, bright red, and even the last part of the calyx lobes. So it's a perfect contrast between the green leaves and the red infructescence. Fresinesia, which is a small species, we see it's climbing, and we see actually that it is adult because we see these three parts, and one of the three parts are still the remaining part of a fruit, of a spadis fruit, because usually they are by three like this, so it is a small species of Fresinesia. We clearly see the sympodial growth habit of this Fresinesia. We see the stem was flowering because we see the remaining part of the infructescence at the top of the stem, and just under the inflorescence, 1 or 2 leaves before the inflorescence, a new axis did emerge, and bearing only small leaves, caterpillar-like leaves at the beginning, and then ending with the normally developed leaves, but these one are much a little bit bigger and very bright green, very healthy compared to the older ones, but anyway, it is clearly the same growth habit everywhere here. In this part of Manusela, we are on the other side facing the sea, but still at 1,000 meters above sea level. And on the totally limestone area, we see the big boulders of limestone, of karst. And here I see a very small species of begonia. It is a creeping species. It is obviously adult. I don't see inflorescence, flowers, but it is obviously adult, and it has very dissected leaves, which are very acuminate. We see the long acumen of all the leaves. I should like to see some inflorescences. No, I see nothing, but I see clearly it is a creeping species, so we see the stems creeping and rooting as soon as they touch some mosses or some surface of the rock. On this limestone cliff, we see another species of Medinilla. This one is also cauliflorous, but it has actually not at all long peduncle of inflorescence, but the flowers are totally directly congested on the stem. And we see the leaves, two opposite leaves, which are quite big and light green with dark venation. So it is another species, at least now 4 species of Medinilla we have seen in this Manusela National Park. At the base of this limestone cliff we see a small wild banana. So we see the apex of the inflorescence with the bracts covering the last flowers, and we see here developing the small bananas, and they are bright green, a little bit turquoise. Right, probably they will not become big, of course bigger than this, but probably it's not a big species. I try to see, I take just one of the fruits, how it is inside. It's probably not ripe, but some are ripening green. Yes, so we see, yes, not mature at all. We see the pulp and the developing seeds, but it's not yet mature. In the wild bananas, there is not much to it. It's mostly seeds covered by an arilla, but the seeds are still white and not yet covered by arilla. But anyway, probably it will not become big bananas. This small tree, actually with a terminalia branching, is a Soroya species, not the same as the one we did see along the river, but we see the structure of the inflorescence with many bracts, which are hairy bracts. So we know that the genus Soroya is very well diversified. It's strange because quite few people know this Soroya. Actually, they are very important element of forest understory, and also in some parts a little bit more lighted, but mostly forest understory as small trees, shrubs and small trees, rarely more than 10 meters tall. This tree with a flat crown that we see in many places, which has very wide leaves, and it has a kind of terminalia branching, and we did see brown hanging things, and actually we see that these brown hanging things are flowering stems of the ficus. This is a ficus species, a little bit pioneer, very often on the slopes, with this flat, elegant crown, and we see all these bunches of inflorescence, and they are growing and growing. We see the apex on all this stem, we see the apex with the cataphyls and growing and producing always the new figs all along this stem, and new stems arise also from the bigger branch. We see some are very long. This one is maybe 1.5 or maybe 2 meters long, and it is branched. We see all these stems with the cataphyls. Figs are very small, so probably figs are not the same in male and female individuals. It's very often the case, but here I don't know. Even I don't know if they are white, but what I see is that it's a so strange vision when we see this along the road. So the figs, yes, I think it's a male one because the figs become detached. We see these very, very small figs. So when I try to open one of them, yes, we see the cavity in the middle. Even in a small species like this, difficult to know if there are mature acants or not in this cavity. One of the smallest cicones in the ficus genus. This small palm in forest understory, I say small because according to the diameter of the stipe and all the leaves are the same size, not increasing, so probably it is totally adult like this. When we look at the leaflets, it really looks like Caryota, or Arenga or Caryota. When we look at the leaflets, the shape with fishtail shape, but actually when we look at the sheathing base of the leaf, which has a long sheathing base like this, it is much more like the arecoid group of palm. So I don't know what it is, but it's probably not of the Caryota arenga alliance, probably something different, but I'm just surprised to see this shape of leaf, which is for me characteristic of caryotoid palms, but I'm not at all specialist of palms. This plant with quite herbaceous leaves, not at all rigid and reclining like this, according to the shape of the leaf, the length of the pétiole, it is a native species of a cordyline. So the genus cordyline we know is mostly from Pacific Islands, and except one species in South America, in Brazil, but most species from New Guinea, and also the other Pacific islands. And here in Maluku, so there is one species. It is quite herbaceous. It has a long stem, but much more herbaceous than the commonly cultivated one. And it is totally bright green, so not so usual, but it's very nice in forest understory. We see it's probably adult, the palm here, and we clearly see the very long sheath. It's the same as the beautiful red Certostachys, for instance, but the leaves are obviously totally different. So now we are absolutely sure it is a small species of palm because this one is adult with the inflorescence axis here, of course, emerging from the base of the sheath of the last leaf. So the petiole of the last leaf is this one, and we see the sheath turning and wrapping totally the base of the other leaf sheath, and we see inflorescence. This one is a young one with a spat still protecting the future inflorescence. Yes, probably an arecoid palm, but special leaf shape. An Allocasia with beautiful striped petiole. We see the brown lines, the zebra structure along the petiole and also on the sheath, which is very, very elegant. And even the leaf shape is perfectly triangular, quite thick structure. So this is another Allocasia we did not see before, and it's very elegant. This plant is hornbill. This plant is a grass. It's a forest understory grass, so a shade-loving grass, because many people think that grasses are always in full light, but not at all. Some species, especially in Africa, are totally adapted to the low light level of the forest understory, and this one belongs to the genus Leptaspis. There are quite few species, and Leptaspis is from Africa and from Southeast Asia and also Pacific Island. And it has something quite characteristic, that the leaf blade actually is totally turned to expose the lower leaf surface. We clearly see here, for instance, in the young leaf, that there is torsion of the petiole because the leaf should be like this. And finally, it turns on the other side, exposing the midrib, because we know that usually the midrib of the leaf is much more prominent on the lower surface, abaxial surface of the leaf. So it turns the leaf. So why? Probably about photosynthesis, it's more efficient like this, but it's quite strange. Probably position of the chloroplast is mostly on the lower surface of the leaf more than on the upper surface. But it's always like this for Leptaspis and also for the genus Pharus in South America. Along this trunk we see an Aracea which is climbing. We see these entire leaves like this, quite usual, nothing special, but we see the quite huge infructescence with the bright red berries, and this is obviously the genus Anadendron. It's very strange because the genus Anadendron is probably the poorest known genus of Aracea in Asia and Pacific. There are only maybe 4 or 5 species which are described, but probably many tens or many dozens of species. So huge work has to be done. In Borneo, for instance, there are many species not yet described. And here, of course, in Maluku Islands, it's almost sure that this plant is not known at all. But anyway, it is the genus Anadendron and very beautiful red berries. I should like to be a small forest understory bird in order to swallow these bright berries, which seem delicious, but I have to be careful. I'm not a small forest bird. These very elegant small palms are most probably baby rattans, but at this stage they have no spines. They are very, yes, very smooth, no spines, but I think most probably baby rattan, because but when I see this palm, which is not at all a rattan, and it has quite similar leaves, so maybe actually it's not at all a rattan, but maybe this palm, oh yes, so it will be never spiny. It is this palm, I don't know. Oh yes, very elegant palm. Almost black stripe due to the leaf sheaths remaining along the trunk. Bon. Here we are in the garden of the place by Sonny inside the forest. We are at about 200 meters above sea level, so quite low. And he did create this space 4 years ago, and he did bring a small plant in the forest of the big crinum we did see yesterday inside the forest. And here it is perfectly flowering, and we see the incredibly huge inflorescence. Of course, perfume is a perfect perfume of a crinum, but we see, compared to the usual Crinum asiaticum, we see the size of the leaves is totally different, and we see the inflorescence with an incredibly huge number of flowers. The lobes, petal-like lobes, are very long, and the flower bud itself is about 15 centimeters, and the peduncle also 10 or 12 centimeters. So it's a much bigger species than Crinum asiaticum. And Crinum asiaticum, we know, is mostly growing in mangroves and also on sand near the beaches, not at all inside the forest. And the leaves of Crinum asiaticum are about half the width of this one. So it is really a huge crinum, and we see here the perfect leaf arrangement. And oh yes, and here, yes, and we see the size of the fruit. It's an incredibly big fruit, only 2 develop here, and a seed. Maybe this species is not known at all, because we can find it in forest around here, but maybe only in Seram. I'll have to check, but very few crinum species are known to occur in Maluku. Here we see an old fruit, many old fruits, and all the big seeds, and we see actually that these seeds are producing new stems. So I try to take one. just to see. Okay, so we clearly see the germinating habit. So we see the seed and the cotyledonary sheath. We see emerging from the seed, the roots appearing at the base, and from the cotyledonary sheath is emerging the new stem of the crenum. So a new population is establishing here. We see the adult plant of the cordyline, and we see the red berry fruits and young inflorescence also. This pandanus in the forest understory is not much branched, but we don't see the top, but the leaves are very long and quite narrow. But what is very strange in this species is the type of the stilt roots. Of course, many pandanus have stilt roots like this, but these ones have a very special design because we see it's exactly like a cactus, like a cereus or something like that. There are deep grooves all along the root from which emerge at the top of the crest, along the crest, spines, really very sharp spines emerging from the crest, and between the crest it's deeply grooved. So it's not at all common to see this type of stilt roots in the pandanus. The trunk is a little bit spiny, but not so much, especially compared to these roots. So it's difficult to know if it's a mechanism of defense against which animals, because there are not so many placentary mammals, except the cuscus, very few mammals, but maybe cassowary would like to eat the young roots emerging, but anyway, maybe it's absolutely for no protection at all, simply a good way to penetrate the substrate. I'm among the tall stems of an Elatostema species. It's almost 2 meters tall, 1.5, and which is, of course, perfectly disticus. It is quite classical shape, but what is interesting that we see the vegetative propagation is usually very efficient for the small creeping species, but this one is an erect species, and also, of course, when the old stems are falling, they are able to sprout again from the horizontal stems. And we see the leaves are very shiny because it's raining, and an Elatostema of this size in forest understory means that it is raining a lot, really a lot, because when it's not so much rain, Elatostema are usually much smaller. So it's really a rainforest. Even if you are only at 200 meters above sea level, it is raining a lot. Here on the forest floor, we see a beautiful population of an orchid according to the disticus habit on the brown leaves. I know that some Malaxis are like this, but of course there are different genera in orchids, but the leaves are absolutely perfectly brown, golden brown. There is a terminal inflorescence, which is not very spectacular, of course, but we see the small yellowish flowers, and it is growing along the soil, and we see actually that there is an active vegetative propagation because we see that obviously these stems are creeping, and we see that while creeping, they produce lateral new stems, and so it creates this population of some individuals. It's very elegant, Malaxis-like, but I know there are many genera like this in Asia, on Pacific Islands. In this area of the forest understory, where there is a small river, it's a kind of a flat ground, a little bit like a flat gully. We see it's dominated by a pandanus species and by a palm. And this palm is very elegant. It has pinnate leaves, and we see that the young stage actually, because just around the adult one, we see all the babies, and we see that the young plants have leaves which are just bifid leaves, and growing like this for quite a long time as bifid, because here we see they are bigger, but still with bifid leaves. Perfect design of this entire bifid leaf, and we see it can persist a little bit longer, because this one is bigger. We see it begins to be a little bit dissected, pinnately dissected. Yes, on this leaf we see the first division of the leaf, which will become this beautiful pinnate leaf. Oh, and we see the venation pattern, which is very, very elegant on this leaf. We see all the details of the venation and the ridges, absolutely perfect, and just above the pandanus, on the crown of the palm. So, elegant area. So on this steep slope along a boulder, a limestone boulder, we see at the base this begonia, which is erect, but looking a little bit like some creeping ones, with the usual leaf shape for begonia. We see the small male flowers, which have, it seems, really 2 tepals only. I see female flowers. Yes, actually we see side by side 2 female flowers with the ovary, perfect ovary. Female flowers have 5 tepals, so it's a characteristic of the Petermania begonia. It looks a little bit like the recently named begonia Manuselensis, but I think that begonia Manuselensis has wider leaves than this, and is more creeping, because this one is mostly erect. So probably it's another group, but it is a group of the section of Begonia Petermania. On the first floor I see a plant with only 2 leaves, a little bit like Amorphophallus, this kind of leaves, but obviously when I look at the fact there are 2 leaves, it is a Tacca, and it's a Tacca of the group of a Tacca palmata. Maybe it is Tacca palmata, but I think there are 1 or 2 other species quite similar. We see the inflorescence, which is quite strange, is that there are 3 bracts, 1 dorsal bract totally sessile and fixed to the peduncle, and 2 smaller lateral bracts which are pedunculate. They have a kind of peciole, and so they are outside the main dorsal bract. So I'm a little bit surprised about this structure. So I'll have to check, and we see two maturing fruit here in the middle, emerging from the base of the dorsal, very wide bract. So it's strange to see these three differently shaped bracts. Just as the name suggests, the Tacca palmata has palmate leaves, and we see the membranous part in the base of each leaflet, medium leaflet, and three leaflets on each side of the medium leaflet, and the kind of web. It's a little bit like some Australasia, the genus Trevesia, for instance. An erect acanthaceae of the forest understory, which has a very long peduncle for the inflorescence and bright white flowers, very well exposed for pollinators. This climbing Araceae with huge entire leaves is the Epipremnum seramense, so it is at home in its Seram island where it was described in the last century, and we see it's climbing on a Cauliflorus ficus. It is almost unbranched, this Epipremnum seramense. We know many species of Ixora, of course, because Ixora is one of the genera of Rubiaceae, which is common in Asia, but not only in Asia, in Africa also. But this one, anyway, has incredibly huge inflorescence branch, because we see it's a compound inflorescence at each axil of the last leaves of the stem is a perfectly branched inflorescence. So globally, it looks like a single inflorescence, and after the stem is continuing its growth. So it's not so usual, because very often Ixora have just terminal inflorescence and not at all like this successive axillary inflorescence. So this one is really exceptional. And just here, I see also something very strange with the stems arising from the main stem, large leaves on the main stem which have no peciole, totally almost sessile, and the lateral stems with a long first internode in order to have the leaves outside the captation of the light from the central leaves. And we see it's Ardisia, a Myrcinaceae, due to this so strange oval shape of the articulation on the lateral stem on the main stem. So it's very, very rigid, and it's a very good way to maintain this lateral branch. It's almost looking like monocolous, but of course it has lateral branches, and inflorescence will appear most probably on these lateral branches. This Aracea with deeply dissected leaves is actually Rhaphidophora cortalcii. It's a species with a very large distribution from Malaysia to New Guinea. But what is very interesting is that this one is a huge form, because usually the leaves are about half this size. So this one here in Maluku, the leaves are very big. Here, emerging from the ground, we see a huge inflorescence, ginger-like, and this inflorescence with recurved bracts, a little bit spiny at the extremity, is without any doubt the inflorescence of the Tapeinochelys. Tapeinochelys is close to Costus, but actually it's another genus which is characteristic of the eastern part of the Wallace line. So at Maluku, I did not know they were in Maluku. I know they are, of course, in New Guinea. The core is New Guinea, also Solomon Islands. So also here we find in Maluku. And these stems are vegetative stems, and we see the huge stems, which are about 3 or 4 meters long, which are branched, so it's like a costus with lateral branches, and we see the swollen base of the lateral branches like a big node. So this Tapeinochelys is very different actually from the usual costus. We see the old flowers which turn black. It's not developing fruits, it's the old corolla, and here in the middle at the top I see corolla which are still open with 3 lobes. We see the bracts, of course, and we see the flower, the tubular corolla, very rigid. Everything is rigid, even the corolla is very rigid. And here, just the 2 huge ones, very tall, because this one may be 40 centimeters long. It's much bigger than the quite commonly cultivated the Tapeinochelys ananaceae from New Guinea, which is much smaller than this, and we see the huge branch stems. So it's a kind of miracle when we see this inside the forest. Another erect species of begonia, which has very dentate, quite sharply dentate leaves, and what is very beautiful is the bright purple color of the undersurface of the leaf. You clearly see a yellowish green point at the extremity of the tooth, so it's a hydatod, so it has very prominent hydatodes on the lower surface. This erect begonia, which is actually bending because it's the stem is long and heavy, we see is the one with the purple undersurface of the leaf, and we clearly see the inflorescence, and we see the hanging fruits. So these were the female flowers, and here we see some bracts. Yes, it is the pedunculate male flower without ovary, of course, with only 2 tepals, 2 opposite tepals, and here female flower not open. This is a Schefflera. In this part of the world, there are many Schefflera, but actually now this is no longer the genus Schefflera for this species from Southeast Asia and Pacific. It is the genus Heptaplerum. It is a little bit similar to the one we know commonly in cultivation, but it is different. There are many species, either growing on the rocks as Saxicolous species or epiphytic. This shrub with square stems and opposite leaves with long petioles looks a little bit like a Lamiaceae, for instance, like a clerodendron or something like that vegetatively. But when we move downward along the stem, we see actually that the inflorescences are emerging from the bark, so it is typically cauliflorous, and when we see the shape of the corolla and of the calyx, no doubt it is a Gesneriaceae, and it is a member of the genus Syrtandra. We know that the genus Syrtandra is very highly diversified in Pacific islands, in Hawaii, for instance, in Fiji, in New Guinea, of course, and in Maluku. There are also species, of course, in Borneo and in peninsular Malaysia, but here very well diversified, and many are quite a big shrubby species like this, but not so usual to see bright red flowers in the genus Syrtandra. A very elegant species of Selaginella. We see it very finely divided. The leaves, the macrophyls are really almost microscopical. And actually it is a climbing species. We see the stem climbing and twining like this around the trunk and producing laterally, pseudo-laterally because it's a dichotomous of course, which are the branches which are the photosynthetic elements, and yes, and at the top are the strobili. Voilà, so very elegant climbing species of Selaginella. And we see actually that this Selaginella has a vegetative propagation through flagelliform shoots. We see it produces long hanging shoots which become totally divided, reaching the ground, so covering the soil and able after to climb on another trunk. It's very strange in the genus Selaginella to see that. Here is a climbing Aracea with very elegant, well, not sagittate, but really long leaves, falcate, like a real lance leaf, and a velvety surface, and we see all the vines impressed. It is probably a Syndapsus or a Rhaphidophora, but it is still young, so we don't know if it becomes bigger than this or if it's an adult shape, but in any case, it is a very elegant plant. This monocolous shrub with so big entire leaves, a little bit dentate on the margin. The leaves are opposite, so most probably this is a Syrtandra, so in the Gesneriaceae. And oh yes, and I see actually in the axil of these leaves I see bracts, quite opposite bracts. So it's really like the inflorescence of different Syrtandra species, same as we can see in Hawaii and mostly in Fiji Island. I've seen quite a big Syrtandra also. But anyway, here it's the biggest we have seen up to now. On this vertical limestone cliff, we see a beautiful population of Monophylia. So Monophylia is a genus of Gesneriaceae, and the particularity is that the plant is reduced to only one leaf. There is two cotyledons, one remains very small and disappears, and the other one is increasing during all the life of the plant. And we see actually that the inflorescence emerge just between the peciolar structure and the unique blade. The flowers are quite small. We see clearly here the small white flowers, but it flowers during a very, very long time. We don't know exactly, but many months, maybe some years, and we see that first one inflorescence appears, but after new ones emerge, always from this junction between the peciolar structure and the blade. So they can produce many months after months inflorescences like this, and after the capsular fruits will dry, and once they are ripe they open and the tiny seeds are dispersed mostly by rain splash and covering the mosses, because the seeds are very small and the seedlings are only about 1 millimeter in diameter. On this rock is a growing Medinilla, another species of Medinilla, which is perfectly growing, much branched, and what is interesting is that we have the inflorescence and infructescence on the same plant. So we see that when it is flowering, the peduncle is pink, but all the peduncles, the primary and the secondary peduncle of the inflorescence are pink, same as the petal and also the stamen. So everything is pink, and later when the fruits are ripening, everything becomes more purple. The axis of inflorescence and the fruits themselves are purple. So every time at each stage the color is the same for the flowers and peduncle, and after the same for the berries and the peduncles also, which become purple. Anyway, it's one more species of Medinilla, so we did see already at least 5 or 6 species in this Manusela National Park. Here we see another more or less climbing, epiphytic climbing Medinilla. We see the leaves, which are typical of Medinilla leaves, and we see the fruits, the berries, which are bright red coral berries. It is cauliflorous because we see that all the inflorescence appear directly on the stem. So it is still another style of Medinilla growth habit. And another Medinilla, this one has a different type of leaves, quite long pecíoles. The leaves are covered with an indumentum of brown hairs. The vines are very impressed, and we see that there are more pairs of vines, and the secondary vines also are very well developed. Internodes are quite long, and the inflorescences also appear along the stem, so it is also perfectly cauliflowerous, but this one has quite a long peduncles for the inflorescence, and actually now it is a fruiting stage, beginning maturation of fruit, so I think maybe they will become more bright pink, but not sure, maybe they are ripe at this stage and they will keep this color. Now I don't count, maybe 6, 7 species at least of Medinilla we have seen in this area. Here in this Sirtandra, we see the two bracts enveloping not the flowers but the maturing fruits, protected by the two foliaceous bracts. So climbing on this tree, we see a pothos, but it's not at all the section, the subgenus Eupothos with winged petiole. It is the section or subgenus Allopothos, so it is totally different group of pothos which has entire leaves. This one has very big leaves, very wide and very shiny, and we can see the red spadix with the fruits, the red berries, and usually there is only one big seed in each berry. So this pothos is quite common here, and it's very particular because also in New Guinea some pothos with big leaves like this are existing, but not in Western Malaysia. Here we see a Fresinecia. It's a climbing member of the Pandanaceae. There are only Pandanus and Fresinecia and also Sararanga, which has very few species. And it's quite strange because Fresinecia are very common in Asian forest and also Pacific Island forest, and even in New Caledonia a lot of Fresinecia, till reaching New Zealand in temperate zone, but very characteristic of tropical forest of Asia. And here in Maluku we see quite many species. This one is a small species we see with narrow leaves. It is adult like this, some are much bigger, and here is also another small species which has very different shape of leaves. Here we clearly see this other species which has quite short leaves, very recurved leaves, very rigid, which has a petiole. So we see side by side two different Fresinecia species. So we see actually that the Fresinecia are really a characteristic element of the forest understory, but they can climb sometimes up to 10 or 12 meters in height. One more species of a ficus, a Cauliflorus ficus. I'm surprised to see so many ficus here, which are Cauliflorus. Here at about 1,000 meters above sea level, it's really a mossy forest. All the trunks are covered with mosses and also with ferns. We see here a very narrow, very elegant nephrolepis. And here is a population of a fern. It's actually like a small tree fern, but it's, I don't know which groups. There are so many species, about 700 species in Seram. And we clearly see the trunk, the stipe, which is not a huge diameter, only 3 or 4 centimeters. And it produces, of course, the fronds at the top. And these fronds are quite usual for fern. It's a pinnate fronds. And I look, oh yes, there's a sorry on the lower surface, so it's clearly an adult individual. We clearly see the rows of the brown sorry along the main vine of each small lobe of the pinnules. So we clearly see on the lower surface of the fronds all the lines of sorry, and it's very elegant because the top part is sterile and it's a light green, so it's a beautiful contrast between the brown sorry and the light green upper part of the frond, same as the insertion of the frond on the rachis. And on this mossy trunk, we see these blue, turquoise blue things, and I think actually it's a lichen, because I don't think it's hepatic like this, probably a lichen, which is really a little bit blue iridescent. We have seen quite many shrubby species of Medinilla, either epiphytic or saxicolous on the vertical rocks, but there is also another group of Medinilla which are totally climbing, and we see here, for instance, one of them, and these climbing Medinilla usually have leaves verticillate by 3 or most often by 4. So here we clearly see the leaves verticillate or pseudo-verticillate by 4, 2 bigger in the lower part and 2 smaller in the upper part. Same here. So they are climbing, and usually they are flowering on the old stems, old climbing stem, because it's climbing all along the trunk. We see another hanging branch here. So it's a totally different growth habit in this Medinilla. So we see on the forest floor a very surprising blue mushroom, totally blue. we see the incredibly blue color of the lamellae of this mushroom. Also the peduncle is bright blue. On the mosses, on this limestone boulder, there are many individuals of a strange small plant. We see some individuals here. We see bigger ones here. Here I see something which could look like a fruit. Ooh la la, what is this? It has quite rigid leaves, maybe an elatostema, not sure. It looks a little bit like a begonia, but almost sure it's not a begonia. It is plagiotropic. It's everywhere in the mosses here on this rock. We should see the flowers, but we don't see. It seems it's adult because it never becomes bigger than this. It seems adult, but who is this guy? I don't know. Even the family, I can say nothing. Maybe Urticaceae, but just maybe. Cauliflorus shrub. So it's very translucent, very fleshy. But at this stage, difficult to. I think it's a developing fruit, and maybe this is the corolla which becomes fleshy. Not sure. We see clearly it's cauliflorus. We see a peduncle here. We see the leaves, which are alternate. But maybe actually it's opposite leaves with a very small scale leaf opposite to the big leaf. In this case, it could be a Syrtandra. In this mossy forest at about 1,000 meters above sea level, we see some very beautiful trees. We see many epiphytes, ferns, orchids. So it's rich in the upper part of the forest. We see some Fresinecia also, of course. But on the forest floor, of course, there are mosses, but very few understory plants, probably because many leaves are falling. And also, what is sure is that all this part of the world, east of Wallace Line and southern part, including New Zealand, there are very few Herbaceous angiosperm, very few among the Herbaceous rubiaceae, Herbaceous gesneriaceae, Herbaceous melastomataceae, like Sonerilla, etc. So probably it's because there are originally few elements of herbaceous plants in forest understory. And most of them we can see are seedlings of trees, and of course it's very rich in tree species, of course. This is a small erect yellowish structure, very mushroom-like, like a coralliform mushroom. Actually, when we look more closely, we see that it's a branched axis, branched stems, and we see tiny 1 millimeter long projections on each side. So it is actually an angiosperm, a parasitic angiosperm. I don't know which family, of course, but it is not at all a mushroom. It is a parasitic flowering plant. It could be also not parasitic, but simply in association with mushrooms, saprophytic, but I think it's parasitic more than saprophytic, but very difficult when we see like this if it is parasitic or saprophytic, because we should know which is the connection under the ground, if it's connected to the roots of another plant or simply connected to dead decomposing leaves. we clearly see the branches. And we see all the tiny structures, which are obviously small flowers. We clearly see the small emerging 1 millimeter long structure, which are the flowers. This hanging infructescence, which is balancing like this with beautiful bright orange berries. So it's the infructescence of the Pleurantodium. So in the ginger, before it was merged with Alpinia, but now separated. And here, just here, also we see a Lea, which is close to the family Vitaceae, and here we see quite many Lea, some with quite small leaves, some with big leaves like this. So they are very well thriving in this forest at mid-altitude. It's not surprising, they are often in this type of forest in Southeast Asia. So we see, and this is probably a Soroya, when I see the leaves like this. So now we begin to be a little bit familiar with all these creatures. We see that the fruit of the Pleurantodium is opening in 3 valves, so the small seeds, black seeds, embedded in a bright red arilla. So the contrast between the orange color of the outer part of the fruit, the black, shiny black seeds, and the bright red arilla, the pulp, because of course birds are interested by the red arilla, which is maybe tasty.
Ça a l'air, hein?
Ça a l'air. And we see clearly the quite small seeds. We clearly see the compound leaves of this Lea. It is not a branch. Usually Lea are poorly branched or totally monocolous, but the leaves are very, very strongly inserted. We see the base, which is swollen, geniculate at the base, which is a good way to have a good rigidity of the leaf when it's a huge leaf like this. We can see the huge terminal infructescence of the Lea, so it's totally terminal. These are the last leaves, and we see these berries. We see it's closely related to the grape family, Vitaceae, sometimes merged into the Vitaceae, and we see actually that the fruits look a little bit like grapes, but not ripe at this stage. We are in the heart of Seram, in the Maluku, but when I see this creature, I feel I'm going back to Malaysia, because this actually is the first individual we see of probably the genus Codonobea, but it is obviously one of these small Gesneriaceae growing on the slope. So we see the flower, which has a very, very characteristic corolla recurved like this, and we see also the maturing fruit, which is capsular fruit open along the top. So this is a Codonobea or Codonobea alliance. So it's the first I see here in the Maluku. So finally it's possible to have this group of small understory plants, but probably very few species. And here, so strange, we see this resin, very white resin, and when we look on the soil, when we see the leaves, all these brown leaves, we clearly see it is the leaves of an agathis. So this is an agathis, like the kauri in New Zealand, for instance, but of course another species. It has a huge trunk, one of the biggest trees of the forest here. So it is agathis, and probably the resin is sometimes collected. We see there are incisions by people to collect the resin. Sometimes it's called damar resin. It's very rigid and totally translucent, white translucent resin. So it's a conifer, of course. Agathis is this group of austral conifers. I did not know they were in Maluku. We have seen so many agathis in New Caledonia, for instance, and it is a genus which is mostly in the South Pacific area. We see also in New Zealand, so of course in New Guinea. Some also are, if I remember, up to Borneo, but here in Maluku we are on the Pacific side. So in this very humid area, we see, of course, at 1,000 something meters above sea level, mosses, ferns covering every support, either trunks or small branches or the rocks. And so we see many species, of course, many ferns, many elatostemma, and this so strange plant which has iris-like leaves and which I suspect to be a member of Hemodoraceae. And so I'm just surprised because Hemodoraceae usually are from more open area, except for instance Xiphidium and Schickia in South America, but usually in Australia, for instance, Anigoxanthos are mostly in open areas and quite dry areas. Here it's not at all dry, it's totally pure humid, and so they are very well growing, and we see some have fruits and old inflorescences. We see it's very rich. Oh yes, here I see a small elatostemma, which is obviously a rheophytic species when the current is strong, so it has very characteristic long leaves of the rheophytic species, as it's quite similar in New Guinea or in Solomon Islands, in really the same type of habitat for these rheophytic elatostemma. So here again the Hemodoraceae. So we did just see the Codonobea before, so it's a really quite rich here. This is a white translucent fruit of this strange plant. It seems it's three-parted. I try to take one. I try to take this one. So it's a really fleshy. Oh yes, and when we open, we see actually these are tiny seeds. We clearly see the very, very small seeds. 1 millimeter long. A very strange plant is climbing along this trunk. It has totally indented leaves, which are purple on the under surface, same as the long pétiole. What could it be? Oh, well, I see here. It seems it has opposite leaves, so probably it could be a member of the Gesneriaceae, and I try to see if they are really opposite. It could be something like Agalmilla, for instance, this group of Gesneriaceae, but it's very strange, totally covered with hairs, totally oppressed white hairs. We see clearly the hairs. Everything is wet, of course. So I don't know, I don't see the flowers, so it's impossible to know who is this creature. Could look also like some Asteraceae, but I don't think. No, I think it's probably Agalmilla in the Gesneriaceae.